Every morning, 2 billion people wake up and do the same thing. Before they speak to anyone, before they check their phones, before they face whatever the day has decided to bring them, they reach for a cup of something dark and hot and bitter, and they drink it, and something in them settles. Something wakes up that sleep had put away. Something that feels in that first moment like the difference between existing and being alive. 2 billion people every single morning. The same ritual performed in 10,000 languages, in apartments and farmhouses and offices and tents and palaces, by presidents and farmers and artists and soldiers and students, and the very old and the very young. The most widely shared daily ritual in human history. More universal than any religion, more consistent than any cultural tradition, more reliably practiced than sleep itself. And almost none of them know the story of what they are drinking. They do not know about the goats. They do not know about the Sufi mystics who drank it through the night to stay awake for prayer, or the Ottoman Empire that tried to ban it 3 times and failed 3 times, because you cannot ban something that people want that badly. Or the coffeehouses of 17th century London, where the entire intellectual foundation of the modern world was built over cups of something that cost a penny. Or the moment in 18th century Paris when the closing of a coffee shop helped trigger a revolution that changed the political structure of the entire Western world. They do not know that coffee was once considered so dangerous that people were executed for drinking it. They do not know that the caffeine in their cup is a chemical weapon evolved by a plant to kill insects, that human beings discovered and decided to drink every morning because it made them feel good, and then built a global civilization partly around the need to keep feeling that way. They do not know that the coffee in their cup traveled further to reach them than almost any other substance they will consume today. That it was grown in soil on the other side of the world, picked by hand because no machine has yet been built that can do it reliably, processed and dried and shipped across oceans and roasted and ground and brewed through a sequence of steps, each of which, if done slightly differently, produces something that tastes entirely unlike what they are drinking. They just know that they need it. That need is the most important fact about coffee. Not its chemistry, not its economics, not its history, though all of those are extraordinary. The need. The particular quality of the relationship between this substance and the human beings who consume it. A relationship so intense and so consistent across so many cultures and so many centuries that it raises a question that is more interesting than it first appears. Why this plant? Out of the hundreds of thousands of plant species on Earth, out of the thousands that contain biologically active compounds that affect human consciousness, Out of every berry and root and leaf and seed that human beings have tasted and tested and experimented with across hundreds of thousands of years of existence on this planet. Why did this one, a shrub growing in the highlands of Ethiopia that nobody outside that region had ever heard of 1,000 years ago, end up becoming the second most traded commodity on Earth after oil? The substance that more money changes hands over every single day than almost anything else in the world. Why coffee? The answer is a story. A story that begins with a goat herder in the mountains of ancient Ethiopia who noticed something strange about his animals, and ends with a $50 billion global industry and 2 billion cups consumed before most of the world has finished breakfast. And somewhere in the middle of that story, coffee changed the world. Not gradually, not quietly, not in the slow way that most agricultural products shape the societies that grow and trade them. Coffee changed the world by changing the way people thought, by keeping them awake long enough to think more and more clearly than they had before. And what they thought in those long caffeinated hours in the coffeehouses of Istanbul and London and Paris and Vienna turned out to matter enormously. This is the story of the most important drink in human history. It starts in the dark, on a hillside in Africa, with an animal eating berries that it should probably not have eaten. The goats were behaving strangely. This is where every account of coffee's discovery begins, and the fact that it begins with goats is either charmingly mundane or cosmically appropriate, depending on your tolerance for the idea that one of the most consequential discoveries in human history was made by an illiterate herder watching his animals eat berries on an Ethiopian hillside sometime around the 9th century CE. The herder's name in the legend that has been told for 1,000 years was Kaldi. He was tending his goats in the highlands of Kaffa, a region in southwestern Ethiopia, whose name may or may not be the etymological origin of the word coffee, a question that linguists have been arguing about for centuries without reaching consensus. The highlands of Kaffa are extraordinary, green and cool and dramatic, cut through with deep valleys and vast rivers, rising to altitudes where the air is thin and the light has a particular clarity that people who have been there describe with the kind of language usually reserved for religious experiences. It was in these highlands, at altitudes between 1,500 and 2,000 meters, that Coffea arabica evolved. Not cultivated, evolved. The coffee plant is native to Ethiopia, specifically to these highland forests, where it grew for millions of years as an understory shrub beneath the canopy of larger trees, adapted to the particular combination of altitude and rainfall and soil chemistry of this specific region of the world. Coffee is not a crop that humans invented. It is a plant that humans discovered, already perfected by millions of years of evolution, for the precise conditions of the Ethiopian highlands, already producing the berries that would eventually change the world. Chaldee's goats found it first. The story goes that the goats ate the red berries of a shrub they had not eaten before, and that night they did not sleep. They were active and energetic through the hours when they should have been resting, and Chaldee, watching them, understood that the berries had done something to them. He tried the berries himself and felt what his goats had felt, an alertness, an energy, a sense of being more awake and more present than he was accustomed to feeling. He brought the berries to a local monastery. The monks, according to the legend, were skeptical. The abbot threw the berries into the fire, either because he considered them suspicious or because he believed them to be the work of the devil, which, in the religious framework of 9th century Ethiopia, was a practical and immediate concern rather than a metaphor. When the berries hit the hot coals, they began to roast, and the monastery filled with a smell that nobody in that room had ever encountered before. The smell of roasting coffee. The monks, moved by either curiosity or the particular quality of that smell, which is one of the most immediately appealing aromas in the human sensory repertoire, raked the roasting beans from the fire. They dissolved them in hot water. They drank the result. And they discovered what Chaldee and his goats had already discovered, that this substance did something remarkable to the human capacity to remain awake and alert. They began drinking it during their long nocturnal prayers. This is the legend, almost certainly embellished, possibly entirely invented. Chaldee appears in no document older than the 17th century, which is a long gap between an alleged 9th century discovery and its first written record. But legends persist because they carry truth even when they lack facts. And the truth this legend carries is that coffee's first human use was in Ethiopia, and that its initial appeal was precisely what its appeal has always been. It keeps you awake when you would otherwise sleep. The actual history, as opposed to the legend, is somewhat less cinematic, but no less interesting. What we know with reasonable certainty is that the coffee plant was being used by people in the Ethiopian highlands for centuries before it became the drink we recognize today. The Oromo people of Ethiopia, one of the oldest continuously existing cultures in Africa, consumed coffee not as a beverage, but as a food. They ground the ripe coffee berries together with animal fat and formed the mixture into small balls that could be carried on long journeys and eaten when energy was needed. A portable, calorie-dense, caffeine-containing food that functioned in the context of the Ethiopian highlands 1,000 years ago the way an energy bar functions today. The berries were also fermented. The outer fruit of the coffee berry, the red pulp that surrounds the bean, was used to make a fermented drink called kishur in some traditions, and by other names in others. A mildly alcoholic, mildly caffeinated beverage that was not coffee as we understand it, but was the first step in the long process of humans figuring out what to do with this plant. What we also know is that the coffee plant itself is doing something specific with its caffeine, something that is important to understand because it reframes the entire human relationship with this substance. Caffeine is a pesticide. The coffee plant produces caffeine not for human beings, but for itself, as a chemical defense against the insects and other organisms that would otherwise eat its leaves and seeds. Caffeine is toxic to most insects. It interferes with their nervous systems and kills them or drives them away, protecting the plant's reproductive organs, the seeds, from predation. The coffee plant did not evolve caffeine for us. We just noticed that the same compound that kills insects does something quite different to the much more complex nervous system of a mammal. Instead of killing us, it blocks the receptors in our brains that register fatigue. Adenosine, a chemical that accumulates in the brain during waking hours and creates the sensation of tiredness, normally binds to specific receptors and produces drowsiness. Caffeine molecules are shaped similarly enough to adenosine that they bind to the same receptors without activating them, physically blocking the fatigue signal. You do not become less tired when you drink coffee. The adenosine is still there, still accumulating. You simply stop receiving the message that you are tired. The tiredness is still happening. The coffee just disconnects the alarm. This is why the crash comes later. When the caffeine metabolizes and clears the receptors, all the accumulated adenosine binds at once, and the tiredness hits with a force proportional to how long it has been suppressed. The coffee plant evolved this compound to protect its seeds. Human beings found those seeds, discovered that consuming them produced a temporary and highly appealing alteration in consciousness, and proceeded to spread the plant across the entire world. Coffee is now cultivated on every tropical continent. It is grown in dozens of countries across South America, Central America, Africa, Asia, and the Pacific. It is one of the most widely cultivated crops on Earth. The plant that evolved caffeine to keep insects away ended up being carried to every corner of the world by the very animals its chemistry was trying to repel. Evolution did not predict this. But it was in Ethiopia, in the cool highlands, where the wild plants still grow beneath the canopy of the forest, that it all started. The trees are still there. The wild coffee plants still grow in the forests of Kaffa and Jimma and the other highland regions where Coffea arabica evolved. They grow the way they have always grown, without human intervention, producing the same red berries that Chaldees goats ate on a hillside more than 1,000 years ago. If you walk into those forests today and pick a ripe berry and bite through the sweet red fruit to the seed inside and chew it, you will taste something strange and slightly bitter and not quite like anything else. You will feel within about 20 minutes a particular alertness, and you will understand in a way that no description quite captures why everything that followed was inevitable. Coffee left Ethiopia the way most world-changing things leave their place of origin. Quietly, without announcement, carried by traders who were interested not in the historical significance of what they were transporting, but in the profit available from moving a substance that people in one place wanted and people in another place had. The most likely route was across the Red Sea to Yemen, a crossing of perhaps 30 kilometers at the narrowest point, a distance the traders and fishermen had been navigating for thousands of years. Sometime in the 14th or 15th century, Coffee plants, or coffee seeds, or both, made that crossing. And in the highlands of Yemen, which share enough of the altitude and climate of the Ethiopian highlands to support coffee cultivation, the plant found a second home. The Yemenis did something the Ethiopians had not done in any widespread or systematic way. They brewed it. The specific leap from eating coffee berries or fermenting the fruit to roasting the seeds and brewing them in hot water is not recorded in any document. Someone, somewhere in Yemen, made this discovery. And it is one of those moments in the history of food where you wish the historical record were better. Because the person who first roasted coffee beans and dissolved them in hot water and drank the result was doing something genuinely new, creating a beverage that had never existed before, something that tasted unlike anything else and did something to the human mind unlike anything else, and would, within a few centuries, be consumed by a significant fraction of the entire human population every single day. We do not know their name. What we do know is that the first people to drink coffee in this brewed form were Sufi mystics. The Sufis were Islamic mystics who pursued direct personal experience of the divine through practices that included extended periods of prayer, meditation, and the recitation of devotional texts through the night. Staying awake through the night, maintaining the focused attention required for these practices across hours when the human body is designed to sleep, was both spiritually important and physically demanding. Coffee, which the Sufis called kahwa, a word that had previously been used for wine and whose application to coffee suggests that the new drink was understood as a substitute for the intoxicant that Islam prohibited, solved this problem with a directness and an effectiveness that must have seemed almost miraculous. Here was a drink that kept you awake, that sharpened attention rather than dulling it, that could be consumed in large quantities without the loss of judgment that alcohol produced, that was, by any reading of Islamic dietary law, permissible. The Sufis adopted it with an enthusiasm that spread rapidly through the religious communities of Yemen and then beyond, from mosque to mosque and monastery to monastery along the trade routes that connected the Islamic world from Spain to Indonesia. By the early 15th century, coffee was established in Yemen. By the late 15th century, it had reached Mecca and Medina, the holiest cities in Islam, carried there by pilgrims making the Hajj, who encountered it in Yemen and brought the habit home. And then something happened that accelerated coffee's spread through the Islamic world with a speed that no other food or drink had ever achieved. Someone opened the first coffee house. The Kahwe Khane, the coffee house, appeared in Mecca sometime around 1475, and in Constantinople, the capital of the Ottoman Empire, around 1555. What happened next was something that nobody who opened those first establishments could possibly have anticipated, because the coffee house turned out to be not just a place to drink coffee, but an entirely new kind of social space, a space that had not previously existed in the Islamic world or anywhere else. Consider what the coffee house offered. A place to gather that was not a mosque, where religious rules of behavior applied, and not a private home where you could only go by invitation. A place that was open to anyone who could pay the price of a cup, which was small. A place where men of different social classes and different occupations sat in proximity and talked, where merchants discussed business and scholars debated ideas and poets recited verse, and ordinary people exchanged gossip and news. A place heated in winter and open to breezes in summer, with comfortable seating and pleasant company, and the particular social lubrication of a mildly stimulating beverage that kept everyone alert and talkative. The coffee houses of the Ottoman Empire became, within decades of their establishment, the primary centers of public intellectual and social life. They were called Mektebi Irfan, schools of knowledge, by those who loved them. They provided newspapers before newspapers existed, spreading news and rumor and opinion through networks of regular customers who carried information from coffee house to coffee house across cities and between cities. They hosted chess and backgammon. They staged musical performances. They became the places where deals were made and alliances formed and ideas exchanged in the particular rapid cross-pollinating way that happens when many different kinds of people sit together in a stimulating environment and talk. They were, in a very real sense, the Internet of the 15th century. And, like the Internet, they terrified the people in power. The authorities of the Ottoman Empire attempted to ban coffee and coffee houses multiple times across the 16th century, and the reasons they gave reveal exactly how threatening the coffee house had become to established power. The coffee houses were places where men gathered without supervision, where they talked about politics and religion and the decisions of their rulers, where sedition could be planned and discontent could find a voice, and the ordinary mechanisms of social control, the mosque, the guild, the household, did not operate. In 1511, the governor of Mecca, Khair Beg, banned coffee entirely, arguing that it was intoxicating and therefore prohibited under Islamic law, and also, more honestly, that the coffee houses were places where his subjects gathered to criticize his administration. He ordered the coffee shops closed and the stocks of coffee burned. The ban lasted a matter of weeks before it was overturned by the Sultan in Cairo, who liked coffee and whose opinion outranked the governor of Mecca's. The Ottomans tried again. Sultan Murad IV, who ruled in the early 17th century and who had a talent for prohibition, banned coffee along with tobacco and alcohol, and made the consumption of any of them punishable by death. His enforcers patrolled the streets of Constantinople in disguise, and people found drinking coffee were beaten. Repeat offenders were sewn into leather bags and thrown into the Bosphorus. People kept drinking coffee. The ban was lifted after Murad's death. The coffee houses reopened. The conversations resumed. The news circulated, and the deals were made, and the ideas were exchanged. And the lesson that every subsequent authority that has tried to ban coffee has had to learn was established for the first time in the streets of 16th century Constantinople. You cannot ban something that people want this badly. You cannot close a door that opens onto something this fundamental to the way human beings want to live. The desire to gather, to talk, to share information and argue about ideas, and conduct the endlessly fascinating business of social existence in a space designed for exactly that purpose. Coffee did not create that desire. The desire was always there, waiting for the right space. Coffee just gave the space a reason to exist. By the late 16th century, coffee houses were established across the Ottoman Empire, from Constantinople to Cairo to Damascus to Baghdad. hundreds of them in the larger cities, thousands across the empire. Each one a node in a network of information and conversation and social life that had no precedent and no equivalent anywhere else in the world at that time. And then European traders arrived in the ports of the Ottoman Empire, and they saw the coffee houses, and they tasted what was being served in them, and they went home, and they brought the idea with them. The world was about to get a great deal more caffeinated. Coffee arrived in Europe like a rumor that turned out to be true. Venetian traders brought it first, sometime around 1600, carried in the holds of ships that also brought silk and spices and the other luxury goods of the Ottoman trade. Venice was the gateway between the Islamic world and Christian Europe, the city that had grown fabulously wealthy by sitting at the intersection of two civilizations and taking a percentage of everything that passed between them. The Venetians were accustomed to foreign substances and foreign ideas. They were, by the standards of 17th century Europe, cosmopolitan in a way that most European cities were not. They took to coffee immediately. The first coffee house in Europe opened in Venice in 1645. Within a decade, there were coffee houses in Oxford and London and Amsterdam and Paris and Vienna, each one carrying the essential DNA of the Ottoman kahve-khane, the public space where anyone could sit and drink and talk, but adapting it to the specific social and intellectual conditions of the European cities where it landed. The timing was not accidental. Europe in the mid-17th century was in the middle of a transformation so profound and so far-reaching that historians have been arguing about its causes and its consequences for 400 years. The scientific revolution, the beginnings of the Enlightenment, the gradual replacement of religious authority with empirical observation as the primary means of understanding the world, the development of new forms of commerce and finance that would eventually produce modern capitalism, new political philosophies questioning the divine right of kings, new literary and artistic movements, new ideas arriving from every direction with a speed and a volume that the existing institutions of European intellectual life, the universities and the churches and the royal courts, could barely process. What European intellectual life needed in this moment of extraordinary ferment was exactly what the coffee house provided: a place to talk. The Oxford coffee house that opened in 1650, run by a Lebanese man named Jacob, became almost immediately a gathering place for the scholars of Oxford University, men who would become some of the most important scientists and intellectuals of the 17th century. Christopher Wren, who designed St. Paul's Cathedral, met there regularly. Robert Boyle, whose work on gases laid the foundation for modern chemistry, was a regular. Robert Hooke, who coined the word cell to describe the basic unit of biological life, drank coffee there and argued about ideas with the other regulars in the particular, heated, productive, cross-disciplinary way that happens when brilliant people are kept awake and alert and placed in proximity with each other. The Royal Society, founded in 1660 and still today one of the most prestigious scientific institutions in the world, grew directly out of the conversations that took place in Oxford and London coffee houses. The men who founded it had been meeting in coffee houses for years before they formalized their association. The coffee house was the incubator of the Royal Society, and the Royal Society was the incubator of the scientific revolution in Britain. In London, the coffee houses multiplied with a speed that suggests the city had been waiting for them. By 1700, there were approximately 2,000 coffee houses in London, one for every 200 inhabitants of a city of 400,000 people. 2,000 places where you could walk in off the street, pay a penny for a cup of coffee, and spend as long as you liked reading the newspapers and pamphlets that each coffee house provided, and listening to and participating in the conversation of whoever happened to be there that day. A penny. That was the admission price. 1 penny for a cup of coffee and access to the information and conversation inside. The London coffee houses were called penny universities, and the name was not entirely ironic. The education available in a well-frequented London coffee house, in terms of the breadth of information and the quality of argument and the range of perspectives encountered, genuinely rivaled what the universities of the era offered. And it was available to anyone who could afford a penny, rather than only to the small elite who could afford university fees. The penny university was a radical institution, radically democratic in an era when democracy was not yet a word in common political use. It placed the merchant next to the lawyer, next to the writer, next to the scientist, next to the politician, and let them talk. And the conversations that resulted were not the conversations of a stratified society maintaining its hierarchies, but the conversations of people who had temporarily set aside the question of who outranked whom, and were simply arguing about ideas. Different coffee houses developed different characters, attracting different clienteles, and becoming associated with different industries and interests. Lloyd's Coffee House, opened by Edward Lloyd in 1688, became the gathering place of merchants and ship owners and the people who insured their cargo, and the informal insurance arrangements made over coffee there became, over time, the institution known as Lloyd's of London, still today one of the world's most important insurance markets. The coffee shop became the insurance market. The conversations became contracts. Jonathan's Coffee House in Exchange Alley became the gathering place of stockbrokers and traders, and the informal trading that took place there became the London Stock Exchange. The financial architecture of modern capitalism was built in significant part in coffee houses by men drinking cups of something that cost a penny. The coffee houses were also where journalism was born. The newspapers and pamphlets that circulated through London's coffee houses in the late 17th and early 18th centuries were the first mass media, reaching audiences that no previous form of publication had achieved. And they were read and discussed and argued over in the coffee houses with an intensity that made the coffee house both the distribution network and the editorial board of the early press. Writers like Jonathan Swift and Joseph Addison and Richard Steele, whose work shaped the development of English prose style, wrote for audiences they knew would encounter their work in coffee houses, and wrote accordingly, with a directness and a wit suited to the rapid conversational environment of the public house. In Paris, the coffee houses played a different but equally consequential role. The Café de Procope, opened in 1686 and still operating today as a restaurant, became the gathering place of the French Enlightenment. Voltaire drank 50 cups of coffee a day there, a consumption rate that his doctors warned him about, and that he dismissed with the observation that he had been slowly killing himself with coffee for decades and seemed to be in no immediate danger. Rousseau was a regular. So was Diderot, who was editing the Encyclopédie, the great project of Enlightenment rationalism, at a table in the Procope, while drinking coffee and arguing with everyone around him. Benjamin Franklin, in Paris as American ambassador, drank at the Procope. The ideas that circulated in that room and in the hundreds of other Parisian cafes of the 18th century were the ideas of the French Enlightenment. The ideas about liberty and reason and the rights of man that fed directly into the French Revolution. When the revolutionary journalist Camille Desmoulins wanted to incite the crowd that would, 2 days later, storm the Bastille and begin the French Revolution in earnest, he stood on a table outside the Café de Foix in the Palais Royal on July 12, 1789, and gave a speech. Outside a coffee shop. The French Revolution, one of the most consequential political events in modern history, began outside a coffee shop. This is not a metaphor or an exaggeration. The coffee shop was the space where the ideas of the revolution had been developed and argued and refined over decades. The coffee shop was the space where the networks of people who would carry out the revolution had formed and maintained their connections. And the coffee shop was the literal physical location where the spark was struck. The drink that the Sufi mystics had used to stay awake for prayer had become, in the coffeehouses of Europe, the fuel of a transformation in human thought and human politics that is still running. 2 billion cups a day, every one of them downstream from a Yemeni mystic staying awake to pray, and a Venetian trader who noticed what he was drinking and thought it might sell in Europe. It sold. Coffee conquered the world on the backs of enslaved people. This is not a comfortable sentence. It is not meant to be. The story of how coffee spread from the coffee houses of Istanbul and London and Paris to every tropical corner of the globe is inseparable from the story of colonial expansion and forced labor and the particular brutality that European empires applied to the project of making the rest of the world produce things that Europeans wanted at prices Europeans were willing to pay. It begins with a plant smuggled out of Yemen. The Arabs who controlled coffee cultivation in the 15th and 16th centuries understood perfectly well what they had. Yemen's port of Mocha was the only source of coffee in the world, and the merchants who traded through Mocha were not interested in sharing that monopoly. All coffee exported from Yemen was first boiled or roasted to render it sterile, to ensure that no viable seeds left the Arabian Peninsula that could be planted elsewhere and threaten the Yemeni monopoly. For nearly 2 centuries, this worked. Coffee spread across the Islamic world and then into Europe, but the plants themselves stayed in Yemen and Ethiopia. The world drank Yemeni coffee because there was no other kind. Then, sometime around 1600, an Indian Muslim pilgrim named Baba Budan made the Hajj to Mecca, and on his way home stopped in Yemen and did something that the Yemeni merchants had been trying to prevent for generations. He strapped 7 live coffee seeds to his stomach, concealing them beneath his robes, and carried them out of the country. 7 seeds. He planted them in the hills of Karnataka in southern India, in soil and climate similar enough to Yemen's that they grew. And from those 7 seeds came the first coffee cultivation outside Arabia and Ethiopia. The hills where Baba Budan planted his stolen seeds are still called the Baba Budan Hills, and coffee is still grown there today, 400 years later, in direct botanical lineage from those 7 smuggled seeds. But India was only the beginning. The Dutch, who were building a global trading empire in the 17th century with a commercial ruthlessness that made even other European colonial powers uncomfortable, obtained coffee plants from Yemen around 1616 and began cultivating them in greenhouses in Amsterdam, studying the plant and learning its requirements. In 1699, they transplanted coffee to their colonial possessions in Java, in what is now Indonesia, and within a decade, Javanese coffee was flowing into European markets in quantities that broke the Yemeni monopoly permanently. Java. The word became synonymous with coffee itself in the English language, a linguistic fossil of the moment when Dutch colonial agriculture changed the geography of the global coffee trade. The Dutch also gave a coffee plant to the French King Louis XIV around 1714, a diplomatic gift that the king installed in the Jardin des Plantes in Paris, where it was tended with the kind of careful attention usually reserved for exotic animals. This single plant, the Jardin des Plantes coffee tree, became the ancestor of nearly all the coffee grown in the Americas today. A French naval officer named Gabriel de Clieu, stationed in Martinique and convinced that coffee could be profitably cultivated in the French Caribbean colonies, obtained a cutting from the Jardin des Plantes tree and boarded a ship for Martinique in 1723. The crossing was difficult. The ship encountered storms and pirates, and a fellow passenger who, apparently motivated by either commercial jealousy or simple malice, tried to destroy the plant. During a period of water rationing on the crossing, de Clieu shared his personal water ration with the cutting, keeping it alive at the cost of his own comfort. The cutting arrived in Martinique. It was planted. It grew. And from that single plant, according to botanical records that have been carefully traced, descended the coffee plants that spread across the Caribbean and Central and South America, and became within a century the source of the majority of the world's coffee supply. From 7 seeds strapped to a pilgrim's stomach and 1 cutting carried across the Atlantic by a determined naval officer, an industry worth hundreds of billions of dollars today. But here is where the story darkens into something that cannot be told without confronting what it actually was. Coffee needs specific conditions to grow: altitude, consistent rainfall, temperatures that stay within a narrow range, rich volcanic soil. These conditions exist in a belt around the equator, a band of latitude running through Central and South America, across Africa, through southern Asia and the Pacific Islands, that agronomists call the bean belt. The bean belt in the 18th century was almost entirely colonial territory, controlled by European powers, primarily the British, the French, the Dutch, the Spanish, and the Portuguese, who had claimed these lands and their resources as their own, and who were developing them with a labor system that had no regard for the humanity of the people doing the labor. The coffee plantations of the Caribbean and Brazil ran on enslaved African labor. Saint-Domingue, the French colony on the western half of Hispaniola that is now Haiti, was in the late 18th century the most productive coffee-growing territory in the world. It produced approximately half of the world's coffee supply. The wealth generated by Saint-Domingue's coffee and sugar plantations was so enormous that the colony was called the Pearl of the Antilles, and it financed a significant portion of the French economy in the years leading up to the Revolution. The Pearl of the Antilles was worked by 500,000 enslaved people. 500,000 human beings transported from West Africa in the holds of ships under conditions of deliberate brutality, designed to maximize the number of people that could be packed into a given space at the cost of a mortality rate on the Atlantic crossing that routinely exceeded 10%. Arriving in Saint-Domingue to work on plantations where the conditions were so brutal and the mortality rate so high that the enslaved population had to be constantly replenished by new arrivals because it could not sustain itself through natural reproduction. They picked the coffee cherries by hand. The same motion, repeated thousands of times a day, in heat and humidity, under supervision enforced by violence. The coffee that filled the cups in the coffeehouses of Paris and London and Vienna, the coffee that fueled the conversations of the Enlightenment and the debates of the philosophers and the schemes of the merchants, was produced by people who had no access to any of the freedom and reason and human dignity that those conversations were ostensibly about. The contradiction was visible. The people having the conversations could see it if they chose to look. Most chose not to look. In 1791, the enslaved people of Saint-Domingue looked at the contradiction and decided to resolve it. The Haitian Revolution began on the night of August 22nd, 1791, with a coordinated uprising across the northern province of Saint-Domingue. It was the largest and most successful slave rebellion in history. It lasted 13 years, defeating the armies of France and Britain and Spain, and it ended with the establishment of Haiti as the first black republic in the world and the first nation in the Western Hemisphere to permanently abolish slavery. The coffee production of Haiti collapsed. The Pearl of the Antilles, stripped of the forced labor that had made it productive, could not maintain its output. The center of world coffee production shifted to Brazil, where the Portuguese colonial system had established plantations that also ran on enslaved labor. And Brazil remained the dominant coffee producer in the world, first under slavery, and then, after abolition in 1888, under labor conditions that were frequently not much better. The coffee in the cups of the European Enlightenment was never free. It was always paid for by someone other than the person drinking it. paid for in labor and suffering, and lives truncated by a system that treated human beings as agricultural inputs, as components of a production process whose only relevant output was the commodity at the end of it. This history does not go away when you order a cup of coffee today. It is present in the economics of the modern coffee trade, in the persistent gap between what coffee farmers in producing countries earn and what coffee consumers in wealthy countries pay, in the structural inequalities of a global market that was built on colonial extraction and has never fully dismantled the power relationships that extraction created. The cup in your hand is connected to all of it, to the stolen seeds and the smuggled cuttings and the plantations and the ships and the 500,000 people who worked the fields of Saint-Domingue and the revolution they made when they decided that the principles being discussed over coffee in Paris applied to them as well. It is connected to everything. It always has been. The Industrial Revolution needed coffee the way an engine needs fuel. Not metaphorically, not in the loose way that people say a city runs on coffee or an office runs on coffee. Literally. The shift from an agricultural economy, where human work was organized around the rhythms of daylight and seasons and the natural cycles of animal and plant life, to an industrial economy, where human work was organized around the rhythms of machines that ran continuously and did not care whether it was day or night or summer or winter. Required human beings to do something that human beings are not naturally designed to do. Work in shifts. The factory system that developed in Britain in the late 18th and early 19th centuries and then spread across Europe and North America demanded a new relationship between human beings and time. The machines ran around the clock. The furnaces could not be allowed to go cold. The looms did not stop because the people operating them were tired. The entire economic logic of industrial production depended on keeping the machines running as continuously as possible, which meant keeping the people who operated them alert and functional through hours when their bodies were telling them to sleep. Coffee was the answer. Not the only answer. Tea had been performing a similar function in Britain since the 17th century, and the British working class's relationship with tea is one of the most deeply embedded cultural facts in English history. But coffee, with its higher caffeine content and its more immediate and dramatic effect on alertness, was the substance that the industrial world increasingly reached for when it needed people to stay awake and functional through the night shift and the early morning start, and the long afternoon when concentration naturally flags. The coffee break, that seemingly trivial institution embedded in the working day of every office and factory in the developed world, is a direct descendant of the Industrial Revolution's need to maintain worker productivity through a working day that was dramatically longer than anything agricultural labor had required. Early factory owners discovered that workers who were allowed brief breaks to drink coffee were more productive during the hours they were working than workers who were not. The coffee break was not a concession to worker comfort, it was a productivity tool. This sounds cynical. It was also genuinely beneficial, which is how the best productivity tools work. The workers who got the coffee breaks were better off for having them. The factory owners who allowed the breaks got more output. The coffee suppliers got more customers. The logic aligned, which is why the coffee breaks survived and spread and became one of the most universal features of working life across the industrialized world. Meanwhile, something was happening in America that would eventually transform the global coffee trade more thoroughly than any development since the Dutch broke the Yemeni monopoly. Americans were becoming the most dedicated coffee consumers on Earth. This had not always been true. The American colonies had been tea drinkers like their British counterparts, until the events of December 16th, 1773, when a group of colonists boarded 3 ships in Boston Harbor and threw 342 chests of tea into the water in protest against British taxation policy. The Boston Tea Party was a political act, but it had a cultural consequence that its participants probably did not intend. Drinking tea became, overnight, unpatriotic, a symbol of submission to British authority. And the alternative, the drink that the coffeehouses of Boston and Philadelphia and New York had been serving alongside tea for decades, suddenly became the American drink. Coffee became patriotic. Thomas Jefferson called it the favorite drink of the civilized world. John Adams switched from tea to coffee after the Boston Tea Party and never switched back. The founding generation of the American Republic were coffee drinkers, and they passed the habit to the nation they built. And the nation built on it in ways that no European coffee culture quite matched. American coffee consumption through the 19th century was enormous by any measure, driven partly by the patriotic association established during the Revolution, and partly by the simple fact that the United States was geographically close to the coffee-producing regions of Central and South America, and could import it cheaply and in quantity. During the Civil War, Union soldiers received coffee as part of their standard rations. Some soldiers carried personal coffee grinders. The journals and letters of Union soldiers mention coffee with a frequency that suggests it was as important to morale as anything else the army provided. Ulysses Grant, commanding the Union armies, was reported to consume vast quantities of coffee throughout the war. The Confederate forces, cut off from coffee supplies by the Union blockade, suffered a deprivation that their letters describe with genuine anguish. Coffee withdrawal is real, and it is unpleasant, and the Confederate soldiers who had been coffee drinkers before the war and could not get it during, felt its absence as a physical hardship, alongside the more obvious hardships of combat and hunger and cold. After the Civil War, American coffee consumption continued to grow with the country itself, and the late 19th and early 20th centuries saw the development of the industrial coffee business in forms that are still recognizable today. Folgers, founded in San Francisco in 1850. Maxwell House, whose name came from the Maxwell House Hotel in Nashville, where it was first served, and whose advertising slogan, "Good to the last drop," was allegedly coined by Theodore Roosevelt, who is said to have drained a cup of Maxwell House coffee and pronounced it good to the last drop. Though, like most stories involving presidents and food, the historical evidence is thinner than the legend. The industrial coffee business required industrial solutions to the problem of freshness. Roasted coffee goes stale quickly. The volatile aromatic compounds that give it its flavor and smell oxidizing and degrading within days of roasting. Selling roasted coffee through a distribution chain that might take weeks or months to move a product from roaster to consumer required either accepting stale coffee or finding a way to preserve freshness. The vacuum can, developed in the early 20th century, solved this problem by sealing roasted and ground coffee in a can from which the air had been removed, dramatically extending shelf life. The vacuum-canned coffee that resulted was not as good as freshly roasted coffee, but it was consistent and shelf-stable, and could be marketed and distributed nationally. And it transformed coffee from a regional product, bought from local roasters who supplied local markets, into a national branded commodity. Folgers and Maxwell House, and the other national brands that emerged in the early 20th century, sold not just coffee, but the idea of coffee as a domestic comfort, a daily ritual of American life, associated in their advertising with home and family, and the particular warmth of a kitchen in the morning. The advertising was extraordinarily effective. By the mid-20th century, the average American was drinking more than 3 cups of coffee a day, a consumption level that made the United States the largest coffee market in the world by a considerable margin. And then, in 1946, in a small workshop in Milan, an Italian engineer named Achille Gaggia perfected a machine that would change coffee forever. The espresso machine. Earlier versions of espresso machines had existed since the late 19th century, using steam pressure to force water through coffee grounds and produce a concentrated brew much faster than conventional brewing methods. But steam pressure limited the force that could be applied, and the high temperature of the steam scorched the coffee, producing a bitter and harsh result. Gaggia's innovation was to replace steam pressure with a spring-loaded piston mechanism that forced hot but not boiling water through the coffee at much higher pressure, 9 bars of pressure. At 9 bars, something happened that lower pressure systems had never achieved. A layer of reddish-brown foam formed on the surface of the espresso, an emulsion of coffee oils and water and carbon dioxide that Gaggia called crema, and that indicated, in a way visible to anyone looking at the cup, that the coffee had been properly extracted. The crema was not just cosmetic. It trapped aromatic compounds that would otherwise escape into the air, preserving and concentrating the flavor of the coffee in a way that no previous brewing method had achieved. Espresso made with a Gaggia machine tasted different from any coffee that had existed before. More intense, more complex, more immediate. The Italian coffee culture that developed around the espresso machine in the post-war decades was unlike any coffee culture that had come before it. The espresso bar, the standing counter where you ordered a small, intense cup and drank it in minutes before returning to the street, was a radically compressed version of the coffeehouse tradition. No lingering, no newspapers, no long conversations, just the coffee itself, consumed in its most concentrated and perfect form. A ritual of 30 seconds that contained everything the ritual needed to contain. Italy became the world's laboratory for espresso culture, developing the vocabulary and the technique and the aesthetic standards that would eventually spread globally. The ristretto and the lungo and the macchiato and the cappuccino and the flat white and all the other variations that fill the menus of coffee shops around the world today are descendants of the experiments conducted in Italian espresso bars in the 1950s and 1960s by baristas who are treating coffee with the seriousness that French chefs brought to cuisine. In 1971, in Seattle, 3 partners opened a small coffee shop that sold high-quality roasted coffee beans for home brewing. They named it after the first mate in Moby Dick. They called it Starbucks. For the first 17 years of its existence, Starbucks was a modest local business, selling beans but not brewed coffee, known in Seattle but nowhere else. Then, in 1983, one of its employees, a man named Howard Schultz, travelled to Italy and visited the espresso bars of Milan and had an experience that he described afterward in terms that sound almost religious. He saw what Italian espresso culture was. He understood with the particular clarity of someone seeing something for the first time that seems so obvious in retrospect that it is almost shocking that nobody else has already done it. That this experience could be transplanted to America. Not the standing at the counter drinking in 30 seconds. The quality of the coffee, the ritual, the sense of a coffee shop as a third place, neither home nor office, a space between the demands of private and professional life, where you could simply be, with a cup of something excellent in your hand. He went back to Seattle and tried to convince the owners of Starbucks to start serving espresso drinks. They were not interested. He left, raised money, opened his own espresso bar, and eventually bought Starbucks and transformed it into something the world had never seen. By 2023, there were 36,000 Starbucks locations in 80 countries. From a goat herder in Ethiopia noticing his animals eating berries, from 7 seeds strapped to a pilgrim's stomach, from a cutting carried across the Atlantic on a ration of shared water, from a spring-loaded piston in a Milan workshop. 36,000 locations, 80 countries, billions of cups, and every single one of them still, recognizably, the same drink. There is a problem with coffee. Not with the taste or the ritual or the 2 billion cups consumed every morning before the world has properly woken up. Not with the chemistry or the culture or the 500 years of history that transformed a shrub in the Ethiopian highlands into the second most traded commodity on Earth. The problem is the climate. Coffee is one of the most demanding crops on the planet in terms of the environmental conditions it requires. Coffea arabica, which accounts for roughly 60% of global coffee production, and virtually all of the high-quality, specialty coffee that fills the menus of the world's better coffee shops, grows within a narrow band of temperature and rainfall and altitude that is, in the language of agriculture, unforgiving. Too hot, and the plant produces inferior beans, or stops producing entirely. Too cold, and it dies. Too wet, and it develops fungal diseases. Too dry, and the cherries do not develop properly. The bean belt, the equatorial band where these conditions exist, is not a large area relative to the surface of the earth, and it is shrinking. The World Coffee Research Organization, which tracks the agricultural science of coffee with the urgency of people who understand exactly what is at stake, estimates that climate change could eliminate 50% of the land currently suitable for coffee cultivation by 2050. 50%. Within the lifetimes of people alive today, half of the world's coffee-growing regions could become too hot, or too dry, or too climatically unstable to support the crop that currently grows there. Brazil, which produces approximately 40% of the world's coffee, is already experiencing the effects. Severe droughts in 2021 destroyed significant portions of the Brazilian coffee harvest, sending global coffee prices to their highest levels in a decade, and demonstrating with uncomfortable clarity how fragile the supply chain that delivers 2 billion cups a day actually is. Colombia, whose high-altitude growing regions produce some of the most prized coffee in the world, is watching those regions become less suitable for Arabica as temperatures rise, with farmers moving their plantations to higher and higher altitudes to find the cooler temperatures their crop requires. A vertical migration that has a hard limit when the mountains run out. Ethiopia, where coffee began, where wild coffee plants still grow in highland forests that represent the genetic reservoir of the entire global crop, is particularly vulnerable. The forest ecosystems that protect the wild coffee plants are being destroyed by agricultural expansion and logging. And the climate conditions that made the Ethiopian highlands the birthplace of coffee are shifting in ways that threaten both the cultivated crop and the wild plants, whose genetic diversity could be critical for developing the climate-resistant varieties that the future will require. The wild coffee plants of Ethiopia are not just historically significant, they are a library. A genetic library containing millions of years of evolutionary adaptation. Varieties that have developed resistances to diseases and tolerances for drought and other characteristics that could be bred into commercial varieties to make them more resilient to the changing conditions they will face in the coming decades. Every wild coffee plant that goes extinct as the Ethiopian forests are cleared takes with it genetic information that cannot be recovered. We are potentially destroying the tools we will need to save the crop. The coffee industry is aware of all of this. The major coffee companies, the roasters and the retailers and the commodity traders have been investing in research and adaptation programs with an urgency that reflects both genuine concern for the crop and very practical concern for their own business models. A world without coffee is not a world that Starbucks or Nestle or any of the other companies that have built empires on this commodity wants to contemplate. The researchers are working on climate-resistant varieties. Crossing Arabica with Robusta, the hardier and more heat-tolerant species that produces the less prized coffee used in instant coffee and espresso blends, to develop hybrids that can survive warmer temperatures without sacrificing the flavor characteristics that make Arabica worth growing. Reviving forgotten varieties. Tracking down old cultivars that were abandoned in favor of higher yielding plants, but that may have climate tolerance characteristics that are now desperately needed. There is a variety of coffee called Coffea stenophila, native to West Africa, that was commercially cultivated in the 19th century and then abandoned when Arabica proved more productive and more flavorful. Recent research has found that stenophila can tolerate temperatures significantly higher than Arabica and produces coffee that tastes, according to blind taste tests conducted by researchers, remarkably similar to high-quality Arabica. It may be one of the most important rediscoveries in agricultural history. A plant that was sitting in botanical collections and West African forests for 150 years, while the crop it might save was developing the crisis it might solve. This is what the future of coffee looks like. Not the comfortable future of more Starbucks locations in more countries, more single-origin pour-overs in more specialty coffee shops, more elaborate brewing methods and more refined tasting notes, and more enthusiastic discourse about terroir and processing methods. A harder future. A future of adaptation and loss, and scrambling to maintain something that 2 billion people have built their mornings around without ever thinking about where it comes from or what it requires. But here is what the history of coffee tells you about its future. It survives. It has survived the Ottoman sultans who banned it and executed people for drinking it. It survived the attempts of European authorities who tried to restrict the coffeehouses where sedition was allegedly being planned. It survived the collapse of the Yemeni monopoly and the Haitian Revolution and the abolition of the slave labor that had made plantation coffee profitable. It survived the First and Second World Wars and the Great Depression and every economic disruption that made global commodity supply chains unreliable. It survived the invention of tea bags and soft drinks and energy drinks and every other beverage that was supposed to replace it or reduce its dominance. It survived because of that need. The need that 2 billion people feel every morning before they have spoken to anyone or checked their phones or confronted whatever the day has decided to bring them. The need that is partly chemical, the adenosine receptors waiting to be blocked, the caffeine dependence that develops within days of regular consumption and produces real withdrawal symptoms when the supply is interrupted. But also partly something beyond chemistry, something cultural and ritual and deeply human. The act of making coffee. The sound of a grinder or a kettle. The smell that fills a kitchen or a cafe in the minutes before the cup is ready. the smell that is one of the most universally recognized and most immediately comforting in the human sensory repertoire. The weight of a warm cup in your hands. The first sip. These things are not just about caffeine. They are about the particular comfort of a repeated ritual in a world that keeps changing. The same act performed this morning, the way it was performed yesterday morning, and the morning before that, and the morning before that. Connecting this moment to all the previous moments, providing a point of stability and continuity in a life that is always moving forward, whether you are ready for it too or not. The Sufi mystics who drank it to stay awake for prayer were finding in it something beyond alertness, a focus, a clarity, a feeling of being fully present in the moment they were in. The scholars of the Oxford coffeehouses and the philosophers of the Café de Procope and the merchants of Lloyd's Coffee House were finding in it not just stimulation, but the particular social warmth of a shared ritual. The way a cup of something hot and good creates a small temporary community among the people sharing it. You feel this every time you make coffee for someone else and hand it to them. Every time a cup appears on your desk, placed there by someone who knew you needed it. Every time you sit across a table from another person with a cup in your hand and feel, without analyzing it, that something good is happening. Coffee is chemistry, and it is history, and it is economics, and it is agriculture, and it is climate science, and it is colonial guilt, and it is corporate strategy, and it is the careful craft of a barista who has spent years learning how to extract exactly the right amount of flavor from a specific bean at a specific grind size at a specific temperature. But underneath all of that, beneath every layer of complexity that 500 years of global history has deposited on this drink, it is still what it was when the Sufi mystics first brewed it in Yemen 1,000 years ago. A way of being awake. Not just physiologically awake, though that too, but awake in the larger sense. Present, alert to the world and to the people in it, ready for the conversation and the idea and the connection that the next hour might bring. Every civilization that has encountered coffee has understood this about it, has built spaces and rituals around it, has made it central to the social and intellectual life of the community in ways that go far beyond the simple chemistry of a stimulant. Because the stimulant was never really the point. The point was what you did with the wakefulness. The ideas you had, the conversations you started, the plans you made, the arguments you won and lost and learned from, the friendships that formed over years of shared cups, the deals that became institutions, and the institutions that became the architecture of the modern world. All of it happened because someone, 1,000 years ago, stayed awake long enough to think it. Outside your window right now, somewhere, a coffee shop is opening. The grinder is running. The espresso machine is heating up. Someone is unlocking the door and turning the sign from closed to open, and getting ready for the first customer of the morning, who will arrive looking exactly the way people have always looked when they need coffee. like someone who is almost awake, like someone who is almost ready for whatever comes next, like someone who just needs one more thing before the day can begin. The cup is almost ready. It has been almost ready for 1,000 years. Sleep well. Tomorrow morning it will be there. It always is.